Chapter 571 Don't make a sound. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Sunny stood motionlessly, gathering whatever strength he had left, which was far too little. Cassie was silent, too, a tense expression on her pale face. With his vision compromised and his shadow sense limited to the circle of runes glowing around the cage, all Sunny could see was a blurry silhouette. He was almost sure that it was a human, however. Something about the dark figure was wrong. Utterly, terribly wrong. A strong smell of blood assaulted his nostrils. The silhouette swayed, and then took a step forward. The scraping sound resounded once again, coming from it. Sunny strained his eyes, and thought that he had noticed a slender sword being dragged behind the person. A hint of recognition appeared in his clouded mind, but in the next moment, a sudden burst of creaky, gurgling laughter threw his thoughts into a spin. Sunny shivered. That voice. The silhouette took another step forward, coming to the point where the flat surface of the floor gave place to the downward slope of the dome. Coincidentally, that was the moment when the dim glow of the runes finally reached it. Sunny flinched. See, curses. A familiar face was looming in the darkness above him. Even through the haze clouding his sight, Sunny managed to recognize the arrogant sentinel who had locked them in this cage a long, long time ago. Only now, that cold and handsome man was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he looked broken and gaunt, his face contorted in a demented grin. But much worse than that. In the place where the sentinel's eyes used to be, two bloody pits were gaping, crimson streams flowing down his cheeks like tears. His fingers were marred with blood, too. As Sunny recoiled, the Lost laughed again, and then suddenly clawed at his face, his laughter turning into a stifled groan, and then into a whisper. Can't get me anymore, can't. Get me. I tricked him. Then, the lunatic abruptly froze. Slowly, his head turned, and the bloody pits of his eyes stared directly at the cage. A moment later, a grimace of hatred appeared on his face. You. It is all your fault, yours. You let him free. Sunny felt weak and barely able to stand, and he was suffering too much to have any energy for fear. So, although it was obvious that the sentinel had returned to exact revenge and kill them, he didn't mind. Instead, he welcomed it. Good. Come here then. Just come here and open the door. You can't try to kill me all you want. Just open the damned door, you wretch. As long as the door was open, they could escape. The Lost swayed again, then made a move to step forward, and stopped. His sword fell to the floor with a clang. Damn you. Instead, a whirlpool of sparks swirled around his hands, and a curved bow appeared in them. Sunny's heart grew cold. No, the sentinel whispered. Die, vermin. With that, he drew the string of the bow. As soon as he did, a ghostly arrow appeared on it, its tip long and sharp as a razor. Sunny held his breath and stared at the tip of the arrow, then slowly turned his head and looked at Cassie, who stood motionlessly beside him. His face grew solemn. Don't make a sound, please, don't make a sound. A moment later, he heard the sound of the string, and saw the arrow streak above the blind girl's shoulder, the wind throwing a few strands of her hair into the air, and shatter against the stones. Cassie flinched, but remained absolutely silent. The sentinel frowned. Alive. I know that you are still alive, but not for long, now. He drew the bow again, and sent another ghostly arrow flying. This time, it flew mere centimeters above Sunny's head. For the first time in his life, he felt actually thankful for his short stature. But the crazed Lost wasn't done. Sunny turned his head and stared directly at him. A ghastly smile suddenly appeared on the sentinel's face. Got you now. He drew the bow again, and then lowered it, aiming directly at Sunny's heart. Sunny did not move a muscle. A moment before the Lost released the string, something small and swift suddenly dashed toward him from behind, and bit his leg ferociously. It was the covetous coffer. Back when everything started, Sonny had left it in the interrogation room on purpose. He couldn't control a memory like he would an echo, but the coffer was still able to follow simple commands. The command it had received from Sonny in those moments was to hide, and then find him. And then wait. The poor thing had loitered near the locked door of the cell for several weeks, hiding every time anyone approached. And now, it was finally able to receive a new command. Attack. The box scurried from its hiding place, reached the cell, and ran through the door on its 8 short iron legs, just in time to sink its sharp triangular teeth into the sentinel's heel. They easily pierced the steel of his armored boot. Blood spurted into the air, and with a surprised shriek, the man stumbled forward, fell, and rolled down the slope of the dome, crashing into the bars of the cage. The arrow flashed past Sonny, missing him by a hair's breadth. But he did not care, already moving. As soon as the damage was done, Sonny dismissed the covetous coffer, and before the runes could devour the tiny amount of shadow essence returned to him by that act, sent all of it into his hurting muscles. And now, he was dashing up the slope toward where the Lost was trying to get back to his feet. Before he could, however, Sonny was already upon him. He thrust his hands through the bars, wrapped one arm around the man's neck, pressed him against the cage, and used the other hand to lock him into a stranglehold. Sonny was weakened by the runes, the hunger, and the thirst, but he still had 3 cores, and 3 shadows wrapped around his body. His strength was fueled by fury, desperation, and cold, murderous will. The 2 men struggled furiously, one trying to break free, the other trying to squeeze the very life out of his enemy. Sonny used everything he had, and then a bit more, strangling the Lost with all the strength he had left in his gaunt, starved body. He knew that there was not going to be another chance. He had to kill this man in order to survive. And even more important than that, he simply wanted to. So, he bit his lip, feeling drops of blood flowing into his dry mouth, and pulled. After what felt like an eternity, when his vision had gone almost entirely black and his muscles were on the verge of collapsing, he felt something snap under his grip, and then the body of his enemy suddenly grew limp. The sentinel was dead. Probably. Sonny let out a shaky breath, let go of the man's corpse, and fell back, sliding down to the center of the dome. He couldn't stand up anymore. In truth, he couldn't even open his eyes. Not that he would be able to see anything. The fight had taken the last of his strength. His chest rose and fell, every breath sending a wave of agony through his body. He didn't think that he could move. That I'm done. Through the haze, Sonny heard someone walk unsteadily past him, and some time later, a loud click. Then, 2 small, weak hands grabbed him by the shoulders, and Sonny felt himself being dragged across the cold stones. He didn't quite understand what was happening. However, soon, his whole body shuddered, and a dark grin slowly appeared on his face. A raging, revitalizing flood of shadow essence was flowing into his 3 cores. He was free. Chapter 572 Sweeter Than Heaven. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sonny remained motionless for a while, then took a look into his soul sea. It didn't seem lifeless and drained anymore. The 3 black suns of his cores loomed above in a perfect triangle, burning with furious dark flames, and the tranquil sea was in turmoil, replete the raging energy. He glanced at the shadow of the sentinel that had joined the silent ranks of his brethren, made a grimace, and closed his eyes. His body was still weak and on the verge of shutting down, but now, satiated with essence, it was not completely useless anymore. He concentrated, then summoned the soul serpent and circulated the essence through its coils, feeling strength return to his aching muscles. His lethargy receded a little. Finally, Sonny opened his eyes and turned his head to look at Cassie. The blind girl was laying on the floor beside him, just outside the circle of runes, completely spent. She must have retrieved the keys from the sentinel's corpse, unlocked the door, then dragged him out of the cage. Sonny didn't know how she had managed to carry him all the way in her terrible condition, but she had. Now, Cassie was barely breathing. However, the color was slowly returning to her face, she was regenerating her soul essence, too. Just the effort of turning his head made Sunny feel dizzy. He rested for a few moments, breathing heavily, then summoned Saint. The taciturn knight appeared out of his shadow, her ruby eyes burning in the darkness. He stared at her from below for a second, then gave a silent command. "Close the door. Guard us." The demon silently turned and walked away, her steps echoing in the silence of the stone cell. Sunny rested some more, then gritted his teeth and tried to sit up. He succeeded on the third try. Water, water, he needed water, all of his being lusted for a single drop of the precious liquid. A swirl of sparks danced around his hand, and then, the most glorious thing he had ever seen appeared in it. It was a dazzling, beautiful, sublime bottle made out of patterned blue glass. Sunny lingered for a few moments, then crawled closer to Cassie, held up her head, and brought the endless spring to her cracked lips. As soon as the first drops of water fell into her mouth, the blind girl opened her eyes, flinched, and then drank greedily. At some point, she raised one hand and grabbed his own, as if afraid that he would take the bottle away. Sunny observed her, his own throat spasming in pain. Finally, he wrestled his hand free and drank his own share. The cold water was, without a shadow of a doubt, the sweetest and most magnificent thing he had ever tasted. Drinking it was more euphoric than being reborn during the awakening, and much more rewarding by far. With each sip, he could feel life returning into his tortured body, as if he was rising from the dead. In these moments, he was probably the happiest he had ever been. It wasn't long before they fell asleep. When Sunny woke up, he felt much better. He was still in a rather bad shape and weak from hunger, his stomach pulsing with pain, but at least not dying anymore. He sat up, drank more water, and looked around the cell. Cassie was still sound asleep, laying on the cold stone floor. She looked to be in a worse condition than him, but there was color to her face, and her breathing was calm and steady. Even though the blind girl did not possess the miraculous blood weave, she was still a powerful awakened. Her body was much more resilient and quicker to heal than that of a mundane human. Sunny suspected that in a couple of days, both of them would be mostly back to normal. Provided that nothing else happens. What were the chances of that? He glanced at Saint, who was guarding the heavy door, then at the cage and the corpse of the sentinel laying near it. His face became contorted by a grimace of disgust. Sunny sighed, then closed his eyes and sent one of his shadows to take a look outside the door. The long corridor was empty and submerged in darkness. Nothing moved there, and nothing seemed to pose any threat. The only thing he saw was another corpse, this one belonging to the partner of the dead sentinel, sprawled near the cell, terribly mangled and in the early stages of decomposition. Sunny stared at it for a while, then commanded the shadow to return. The silence outside was almost eerie. At that moment, Cassie stirred and opened her eyes. She sat down and groaned quietly, then slowly turned her head in his direction. Her second aspect ability must have returned. Or maybe she just located him by the smell. After weeks spent in the iron cage, both of them reeked terribly enough to scare away a pack of hungry wolves. Sunny handed her the endless spring, stared at the bottle in the delicate hand of the blind girl for a few moments, then turned away. Cassie drank the water, coughed, then returned the memory and asked, her voice raspy. "What are we going to do now?" Sunny hesitated for a bit, then shrugged. "First, we need to find some food. Once we are full and strong enough to fight, we'll see. Gather information, assess the situation, then act." She nodded, then slowly rose to her feet. The quiet dancer appeared in her hand in the glow of white sparks. Sunny stood up, too, and headed toward the door. Saint moved aside, allowing him to open it. Standing at the threshold, he hesitated for a few seconds, and then took a step forward. A dark expression appeared on his face. Sunny knew that he had to be careful. But he also felt entitled to some vengeance of his own. Chapter 573 Hunger. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Stepping over the corpse laying at the doorstep of their cell, Sunny and Cassie entered the dark, empty corridor and stopped for a few short moments. They listened tensely to the echoing silence that reigned over it, and then cautiously moved forward. Most humans would have felt lost in the impenetrable darkness, but neither of them found it uncomfortable. Stepping softly, they walked toward the entrance to the closest stairwell, the shadows gliding ahead of them to scout for potential dangers. Sunny didn't let the shadows go too far, though, knowing that he might need their help at a moment's notice. In the past weeks, he had learned everything that Cassie knew about the Night Temple, so there was a clear mental picture of its interior in his head, the parts of the great cathedral that the blind girl was familiar with, at least. Currently, they were at the lowest levels of one of its 7 belfries, deep below the outward ring of the main structure. There were 2 other belfries in the outward ring, and both the ring itself and the 3 towers descending from it remained uninhabited. They were mostly empty or occupied by storage rooms, workshops, and other facilities the Lost used to maintain the citadel. Still, there was no way of knowing what might have changed inside the temple since their imprisonment, and what danger lay ahead, in the darkness. They moved from one level to another, not meeting a single living soul. Here and there, signs of battle could be seen, the furniture was smashed to pieces, the walls scraped by sharp blades or cracked, a few of them completely shattered. The floor was stained with blood, but there were no more corpses around. All they found were a clump of torn, bloodied clothes and several overturned tables, as though someone had desperately tried to build a barricade. Whoever it had been, it didn't seem as though they succeeded. The makeshift barricade was broken, and there was a lot of blood on the floor, the walls, and even the ceiling behind it. Sunny and Cassie walked past, their expressions turning somber. After a while, Sunny finally discovered a storage room full of wooden crates behind one of the locked doors, each containing hundreds of tubes of synth paste. His mouth instantly watered. Food. No matter how much he hated the muddy sludge, right now, he was ready to kill for a single mouthful. Sunny and Cassie opened the storage room with one of the keys attached to the keyring they had picked up from the body of the sentinel, entered it, and then locked the door behind them. Both of them were starving, but before Cassie had a chance to grab a tube, Sunny stopped her. "Don't eat more than one. And eat it slowly." She hesitated, then turned to him with a frown. "Why?" "I'm so hungry." He shook his head and sat down on one of the crates. "If you eat too much, too quickly after going without food for a long time, you might die." The blind girl tilted her head. "What? Why? How do you know?" Sunny opened a tube and shrugged. "Seen it happen." That was just general knowledge among the street kids in the outskirts. However, Cassie had probably never faced real hunger. Even in the Dark City, the inhabitants of the outer settlement had been fed generously by Changing Star and her hunting party during her time there. Sunny was surprised, actually, that normal children didn't learn about such stuff in school. The blind girl lingered for a few moments, but listened to his advice in the end. Each of them slowly ate one tube of synth paste, and then rested for a while. After that, Sunny summoned the covetous coffer, patted it on the lid, and loaded a couple of crates into the small box. "What a good little box you are. Good job, coffer." Then, feeling refreshed and energized, the strength slowly returning to their starved bodies, they moved the crates around and took turns washing themselves with the help of the endless spring. Sunny went first. Taking off the reeking clothes and scrubbing his skin with cold water felt heavenly. When he was done, he summoned the undying chain, and finally felt like himself again. After that, he sat by the door quietly and, using one of the shadows, kept watch on the corridor outside. In the dead silence on the stone belfry, Sunny couldn't help but hear every sound around him, the rustle of the crude tunic against Cassie's skin as she took it off and dropped it on the ground, the murmur of the water as it flowed down her petite, supple body, and the small sighs of relief she made as the weight of several weeks of imprisonment was washed away by it. After a while, she joined him, clad once again in her blue coat and polished armor. Sunny hesitated for a bit, then said, "Come closer." Cassie tilted her head a little, then did as he told. Sunny reached toward one of the extinguished oil lamps and then proceeded to rub her cuirass, pauldron, and other steel elements of the armor with soot. The blind girl frowned, but didn't stop him. "Are you trying to make it non-reflective?" He nodded. "Yeah. Just in case." They still didn't know what powers Mordred possessed, but whatever they were, mirrors and reflections obviously had something to do with it. The undying chain was forged out of bleak steel, but Cassie's armor was too lustrous for him to feel at ease. That was also the reason why he had not summoned the cruel sight yet. The silver blade of the enchanted spear was like a clear mirror, and he wasn't sure what might happen if he did. After Sunny was done covering up the polished steel of Cassie's armor with soot, they rested for a while, ate a little more, and left the storage room behind. It was time to ascend the belfry and return to the outward ring of the Night Temple. As soon as they stepped out of the stairwell and found themselves between the black walls of the main structure of the Night Temple again, a terrible smell assaulted their nostrils. Sunny grimaced, and then covered his nose with a hand. This was the familiar, vile smell of death. Just like the belfry, the outward ring was submerged in darkness. No one had bothered to change the oil in the lamps, and there were no windows to let in the light. The corridors here were wider, and their adornments richer. However, just like before, everything was silent, and there was nobody around. Sunny shivered. Just where is everyone? The Night Temple seemed completely deserted. At first, when they had been hungry and weak, he was glad for it. But now, the absence of people was starting to make him nervous. What the hell had happened here while they were locked up? Moving slowly, the two of them cautiously headed in the direction of the gates leading to the outside. It wasn't long before Sunny noticed a trail of dried blood on the stones beneath his feet, as though someone dead or dying had been dragged across them. Coincidentally, the trail led in the same direction. Soon, the smell of death grew stronger, making it hard to breathe. Sunny and Cassie entered the hall separating them from the gates, and froze. His face darkened. That is not good. Chapter 574 Black Altar. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Before the gates of the temple, a large hall stood, submerged in darkness. The air was permeated with the smell of rot, and at least a dozen of eviscerated bodies lay on the cold stones, staring into nothingness with their empty eyes. Sunny had long become accustomed to such sights, so he wasn't too bothered by it. The implication, however, left him feeling cold. Damnation. He entered the hall, both Saint and the serpent emerging silently from his shadows. Cassie followed, gripping the hilt of the quiet dancer so hard that her fingers turned white. Sunny walked over to the nearest corpse, held his breath, and knelt beside it, studying its wounds. Then, with a grim expression, he moved over to the next one and did the same. It took him some time to check on each of the slain lost, and by the end, his eyes were full of darkness. The blind girl remained silent for a few moments, then asked, her voice tense and trembling. "How did they die?" He lingered for a second, then shook his head. "Sword wounds. Each of the fallen sentinels was killed with one precise, fatal strike. However, most of them were terribly mutilated and covered in multiple wounds, none of them lethal, but all aimed at inflicting the maximum amount of pain. The killer, whoever it was, wanted his victims to suffer before they died. Well, Sunny was pretty sure that he knew who the killer was. Mordred. The man, or thing, that he had set free. It seemed that the Prince of Nothing had a sadistic streak about him. But that wasn't the problem. From everything that Sunny had learned before, he assumed that Mordred possessed a bizarre and powerful aspect that allowed him to deal either mind or soul damage to other living beings. That made him extremely dangerous. The prerequisite for this ability seemed to be looking the prisoner of the Night Temple in the eyes, which was good, since both Sunny and Cassie could naturally counter it, Sunny by fighting with his eyes closed, Cassie by simply being blind. However, these lost had clearly died in a ferocious and bloody melee. That meant that, on top of everything else, Mordred was a fighter of incredible skill, skilled and powerful enough to not only kill a dozen experiences awakened with a sword, but also to play with his victims before he did. Just how was Sunny supposed to win against someone like that? He sighed, then walked past the corpses and approached the gate. Master Wealth had told them that the citadel was sealed, and no one except for Saint Cormac would be able to open it. However, Sunny had to check for himself. He wrapped all three shadows around his body and tried to push open the gates, but to no avail. The heavy doors didn't budge even when Saint joined him. None of the keys their jailers had carried were of any use, too. There wasn't even a keyhole to insert them. Sunny looked beneath the surface of the gates, hoping to see the same type of primitive weave he had seen in the door of the Ebony Tower. But there was none. Curse it. He gave the gates a good kick, then turned around and walked back to Cassie in frustration. "That I guess we aren't getting out of here until the Saint arrives. Which would happen in a week, at the earliest. Would they even be able to survive that long?" The blind girl frowned, then asked with uncertainty. "Where to, then?" Sunny thought for a few seconds. Since they were already stuck in this damned place, why not try and accomplish the task they had come here to complete, in the first place? Let's go check on the gateway. Perhaps the ivory knife was still there, somewhere. Diovico leaving the scene of the cruel massacre behind, the two of them headed deeper into the stone bowels of the Night Temple. It took them a long time to cross the outward ring and enter the central temple. The distance itself was not that considerable, but the bizarre interior of the cathedral was disorienting and sprawling, resembling a vast, convoluted maze of black stone. They also had to remain cautious and move slowly so as to not walk into an ambush. The darkness, silence, and eerie emptiness of the deserted citadel were slowly stretching their already tense nerves. Both Sunny and Cassie had not recovered from their ordeal completely, so they had to stop and rest a couple of times, drinking water and eating small amounts of synth paste. They also encountered more morbid remnants of the struggle that had been going on inside the Night Temple while they were slowly dying inside the cage, rotting corpses of the lost, signs of bloodshed and destruction, as well as things that were too strange and vile to be explained by any kind of sane logic. It was as though they were traveling through the workshop of a mad butcher. With each minute that passed, Sunny grew more and more grim. For the first time since this whole disaster started, he actually began to question the moral implications of what his actions had led to. Even if he had been an unwilling accomplice, Mordred only managed to escape because of him. Had Sunny accidentally released an unspeakable evil upon the world? He wasn't sure how to feel about that. On one hand, he didn't really care about the world, but on the other hand, Sunny didn't like to leave behind a mess without cleaning it up. It was just basic decency. A bit conflicted, he sent the shadow ahead, made sure that everything was fine, and finally led Cassie into the grand hall of the Night Temple. This place was both magnificent and uncanny. It was vast and full of darkness, reminding him of his home in the Dark City. The only difference was that this tenebrous cathedral was built upside down. Far above them, the ceiling was flat and stretched into the distance. The floor, on the contrary, arched downward like a giant bowl, with load-bearing stone seams protruding from it like bridges and roads. The hall was silent and somber, and absolutely empty. In its center, there was a wide stone platform. It was covered in rubble, large pieces of black obsidian laying in piles where the black altar had once stood. They really destroyed it. Sunny stared at the shattered altar, still not quite believing that the gateway was really obliterated. What madness was this? They lingered for a few moments, and then descended toward the platform. There, Sunny spent some time sifting through the rubble, hoping to find the ivory knife. But it was nowhere to be found. All he found was broken obsidian, and pieces of Storm God's shattered statue. Either the knife had never been there, to begin with, or Mordred had gotten to it first. Curse it. Sunny turned the head of the statue, looked beneath it, and then stood up, staring into the empty eyes of the dead goddess with dark fury. Damned liar, a prince of lies, that's who he is. As he was boiling with rage, Cassie suddenly took a step forward and touched him on the shoulder. Then, she pointed toward the other end of the grand hall and whispered. I hear footsteps. Someone is coming. Sunny stared into the darkness, his hand itching to summon a weapon. His eyes gleamed dangerously. Let them come. Chapter 575 Confrontation. You're listening at NovelFull.audio. Sunny was tired of the silence, the emptiness, and the quiet dread. The fear of the unknown had been pressing heavily onto his heart, and for a short moment, he wanted for this burdensome uncertainty to end, no matter how violent and dangerous the resulting confrontation would be. But then, he had to grit his teeth and remind himself that giving in to anger and frustration was a sure way to die. Without knowing the scale of the threat, he had to remain calm and keep a cool head. His hand, already outstretched to summon a weapon, hovered in the air for a couple of moments, and then relaxed. Sunny sent one of his shadows forward, and soon saw human figures emerging from one of the passages, some of them limping, the others carrying stretchers with those of their brethren who were too heavily wounded to walk. The lost, they were the remaining guardians of the Night Temple. In front of them, a woman in a black tunic was walking, her red hair dirty and damp with sweat. There was a grim, dark expression on her face. So there are survivors, after all. There were a dozen or so warriors who could still fight, although they didn't seem to be in the best shape. Several were carrying lanterns and torches, the orange flames pushing the darkness reigning in the great hall back. They were still too far away to notice Sunny and Cassie, but he had no doubt that they would be discovered soon. What to do, wait, or hide? A moment later, the decision was made for him. As Sunny watched, one of the lost suddenly approached Master Weld and whispered something to her, then pointed directly at the shadow that was observing them from the darkness. Crap. Sunny was more or less certain in his ability to contend with one of the ascended knights, provided of course that Saint and the Serpent were on his side. With the dozen lost supporting the opponent, though, it was a fight he would have preferred to avoid. Especially considering that what he needed the most right now was information, which the survivors possessed. Soon, a lone figure separated from the group of battered sentinels and headed their way with measured, steady steps. As soon as Sunny saw who it was, his face darkened. Master Pierce. The man was as rugged and severe as he had been when they first met, his steely eyes cold and hard. The stubble on his cheeks had turned into a short beard and his lusterless scale mail was damaged in several places, but other than that, he looked exactly the same. It was as though the weeks of bloody horror had no effect on him at all. Now, the odds were really not in Sunny's favor. He was still sure of his ability to at least escape, though. If need be. Master Pierce approached the central platform and stopped, studying Sunny and Cassie with a heavy gaze. Sunny cleared his throat and faked a shaky smile. Sir Pierce. Thank the gods, we weren't sure that anyone was left alive. To his left, Cassie suddenly tensed. Knowing that she must have sensed something happening in the next few seconds, Sunny prepared for the worst. However, noting that the blind girl remained motionless, he didn't do anything rash, as well. Master Pierce spoke, his voice dark and heavy. Well. What do we have here? In the next moment, a vast whirlwind of white sparks surrounded the platform. Sunny cursed inwardly, and watched as 10 human figures appeared from the sparks, surrounding them. In an instant, the number of their potential enemies almost doubled. These humans, though, he had to suppress a shiver. Their empty eyes, their empty shadows, no, they weren't humans at all. Instead, 10 echoes were staring at him with lifeless expressions, each radiating an eerie, deeply disturbing, and threatening aura. Pierce stared at them coldly. I see that the two of you are still alive. Sunny looked around, feverishly thinking about how to turn the situation around. Oh, about that. Before he could say anything, he noticed that Cassie turned her head slightly and glanced somewhere behind him, a small frown appearing on her face. Just like that, he knew that someone was there. Which was strange, considering that Sunny was always aware of what was behind his back thanks to the shadows, and couldn't see or sense anything right now. BDNVLDM, the blind girl was proven right, though, in the next moment, when something cold touched his neck and a vaguely familiar raspy voice spoke into his ear. Don't move. Sunny froze. That voice, the female sentinel that was guarding the gates on the day we arrived. Why can't I see her, or sense her shadow? The answer was rather obvious. The woman must have been able to don some form of invisibility thanks to her aspect. That was one nasty ability. He pretended to tremble. Yes, yes. I am not moving. For a couple of moments, no one spoke. Then, Cassie turned her face toward the fearsome master and said. Sir Pierce. I would appreciate it if you could give us shelter and explain what is happening. We barely escaped the cage you put us in alive, and being met with such hostility is not how we imagined finding fellow humans again. He stared at her for a bit, then grinned. Give you shelter. That is a good joke. Give me one reason to not kill you both, instead. Cassie frowned, but did not show any fear. Instead, she remained silent for a few seconds, and then said in a calm and even voice. You can try. You will certainly succeed. But not without paying a cost. Awakened Sunless and I might not be ascended, but we did not receive our designations for nothing. How many of your men and echoes will we take to hell with us? She paused for a moment, and then added. How many can you spare? Master Pierce opened his mouth, wishing to say something, but was cut off by Weld, who had approached from behind. The second Ascended spoke in a tired voice. Enough. We can't spare anyone, or anything. I know this and you do too, Pierce. These two are strong, they will be of use. We will take them with us. He grimaced, then spat. What if that thing is hiding in one of them? Lady Weld glanced at Sunny and Cassie and shook her head. They have been locked in the lesser cell for weeks. Between all of us, these two are the least likely to have been taken. Besides, we have just destroyed his previous vessel. There are no mirrors in the Great Hall, so. She sighed heavily, then addressed Cassie. Come. It is not safe here. We must return to the inner sanctum as fast as possible. Pierce gritted his teeth, then snarled and dismissed the echoes. At the same time, Sunny felt the cold blade move away from his neck. In the next moment, the familiar sentinel appeared from the thin air beside him, holding a sharp dagger in her hand. She smiled and winked at him. Lucky you. Well, maybe next time. With that, the woman headed toward the group of the lost and beckoned for them to follow. Sunny briefly glanced at Cassie, sighed, and started walking. He wasn't too happy about how things had turned out, and knew that their conflict with the forces of valor was not over. But for now, at least, there seemed to be a shaky truce between them. Which gave him an opportunity to get some answers. Chapter 576 Lenor Sanctum. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The lost entered the inner sanctum of the Night Temple, its very heart, and bolted the heavy doors behind them. As soon as they did, a field of glowing runes flashed for a moment on the dark wooden surface, and then disappeared without a trace. Sunny glanced at the door with a frown, but didn't say anything. Cassie had never been to this part of the citadel, so neither of them had any information about what was inside. The area was not too large, but right below them was the main bell tower of the cathedral, which was taller and wider than the other 6 belfries. The two masters led their people through somber corridors to a spacious hall that seemed to serve as their current stronghold. There were guards keeping watch in front of the entrance, crates with food and water, a fireplace keeping the cold at bay, and makeshift bedding for people to sleep on. Just from looking at the number of cots, Sunny understood that not everyone had returned from their latest hunt. Or whatever it was that the sentinels had tried to accomplish. All in all, 20.3 lost remained, some of them heavily wounded. With Pierce, Weld, and the two of them, there were less than 30 humans left to oppose the Mad Prince. That meant that in several weeks, Mordred had eviscerated more than 2/3 of the temple's defenders. Remembering how confident Master Weld had been in their ability to contain the prisoner at the start of all this, Sunny couldn't help but shake his head. Mordred turned out to be more lethal and terrifying than even his jailers had expected. The wounded were quickly tended to, and the lost fell on their cots, dead tired. A few went through the familiar motions of maintaining the camp, cooking food, distributing water, and doing other miscellaneous tasks. Everything was performed swiftly and with trained precision, proving once more how experienced and professional these people were. They were obviously fatigued, both mentally and physically, but not nearly as beaten and unsteady as Sunny had thought. Their spirits were not broken. Perhaps because only those with the strongest wills had survived. He also couldn't help but notice that there was not a single reflective surface in the whole of the inner sanctum. The lost wore either armor made out of leather or dull steel that didn't give off reflections, and even made sure to store and drink water from opaque containers, not letting a single drop fall to the floor. After a while, the familiar female sentinel approached them and said, "Sir and lady wish to see you." Sunny and Cassie were led to a separate room, where Pierce and Weld were waiting for them behind a wide round table. Both of their expressions were grim. Weld gestured to a couple of chairs and, after waiting for a few moments, said, "The two of you will follow simple rules. From now on, you are under our command. You will follow any order either Sir Pierce or I give you. You will not use any memory or item that can be used as a mirror inside the inner sanctum, or outside of it, if you wish to live. You will not conspire against your fellow soldiers or tell a single soul about what you have seen here in the Night Temple. If you disagree, leave right now." Sunny and Cassie glanced at each other, but remained seated. Weld nodded, then looked at Sunny. "Awake and sunless, please, describe how you came in possession of that piece of a broken mirror. This time, in detail." Pierce suddenly leaned forward and growled. "And don't even think about lying to us, boy. You won't like the result." Sunny pretended to look at him with a bit of fear. "I couldn't lie even if I wanted to, you fool." He told the tale of how he had encountered the mirror beast on the Reckoning Island and almost lost his life to the strange creature. Knowing that he had to give up at least some valuable information, as well as explain how he had managed to defeat such a dangerous abomination, he shared the detail about using the flaw of his own aspect against the reflection, while not mentioning what that flaw was exactly, of course. After, both masters were silent for a while. Finally, Weld spoke, her voice solemn. So one of his reflections managed to escape, after all. To think that it had been so close all this time. Sunny hesitated, then cautiously asked. "I am sorry, but what was this piece of mirror, exactly? If it was so dangerous, why was I even allowed to bring it inside?" Pierce clenched his fists and stared at him with fury. Then, he uttered through gritted teeth. "The inspection was meant to prevent mundane mirrors from being brought into the Citadel. No one could have expected that there was one more fragment out there, somewhere. If we knew, you would have been killed as soon as you set foot on the Chained Isles. As for what that fragment was, it's not for you to know." Sunny shivered slightly, realizing how big of a target he had drawn on himself by picking up the inconspicuous piece of mirror. No wonder St. Tyrus had warned him to never speak of visiting the Reckoning Island to anyone. While he was thinking that, Cassie finally spoke. "With all due respect, Sir Pierce, we have the right to know. Or rather, we need to. How are we supposed to fight against the threat if we don't know what it is? What, exactly, have we unleashed? What kind of a creature is capable of causing so much death and destruction?" The master opened his mouth to spat a cold response, but Weld spoke first, her voice calm. She is right, Pierce. They need to know, if they are to be useful. She sighed, then looked away and remained silent for a while. Then, Wealth grimaced, rubbed her face, and said, her voice somber and grave. The creature that you have unleashed, that monster, is Mordred of Valor, the Prince of War. Chapter 577. Only you are listening at novelfull.audio. After that statement, the room was silent for a while. Sonny frowned, thinking about what he had just heard. He wasn't really surprised to learn that Mordred was a scion of the great clan Valor. He had already known that there was some connection there. He had also considered that one possible explanation for Mordred's strange insistence on calling himself a prince was a blood relation to one of the sovereign. Now, it was more or less clear that Anvil of Valor was the mysterious prince's father. What made Sonny frown, however, was that Wealth called Mordred the Prince of War. Was that an indication that Clan Valor had inherited the lineage of War God, just like the immortal Flame clan inherited that of Sun God? If so, what lineages did the other two great clans possess? And where did it leave him, who was supposed to become the inheritor of Shadow God, but ended up stuck with a forbidden lineage of an elusive demon instead? Meanwhile, Cassie spoke, her voice slightly surprised. Of Valor. Master Wealth sighed again, then nodded. Yes. Prince Mordred is the eldest son of Saint Anvil, one of the patriarchs of our great clan. As a young child, he was given as a hostage to a powerful ally, to keep peace and ensure prosperity for all. No harm was meant to come to him. And it didn't, or so we thought. Years later, the prince was returned to us as a valiant awakened, to our joy and relief. Pierce's face darkened, and he looked away. Wealth lingered for a few moments, and then continued. But our joy was short-lived. Soon, it became apparent that the boy had grown up to be disturbed. He was cruel, uncaring, and had certain impulses that couldn't be controlled. The more powerful he became, the less human he seemed. And he was powerful, incredibly so. More powerful than any awakened was supposed to be. She looked down, then grimaced. In the end, Prince Mordred left the clan and, breaking the command of the elders, sought out a seed of nightmare to become a master. Knowing that he was too dangerous to be allowed to ascend, or even to walk freely in the waking world, it was with a heavy heart that a decision was made to eliminate him. Monster or not, he was our responsibility, after all. Sonny rubbed his temples. There was a lot of new information in what they were told, provided it was true, of course. Which he wasn't sure that it was. Had Mordred really been given away as a hostage? Was he really disturbed and dangerous? Maybe he was, and maybe he wasn't, or had not been, at least. Whatever the case, Sonny had no doubt that it had no bearing on Anvil's decision to get rid of his firstborn son. The key phrases in all the noble-sounding words Wealth had spoken were, too powerful, and, couldn't be controlled. Mordred had probably been forbidden from challenging the second nightmare for that very reason. That was why he had come to the Chained Isles alone, seeking a seed that had not been discovered, and thus, couldn't be guarded, by the forces of the sovereigns. Which eventually led to his downfall. One thing, however, didn't make a lot of sense. Sonny glanced at the masters, and then asked doubtfully. If that Mordred was so dangerous, why didn't you just kill him? Why go to all this trouble and imprison him, instead? After a short pause, it was Pierce who answered, his voice grim. Do you think we haven't tried? His physical body was destroyed, his spirit body, too. But that still didn't kill him. No matter what we attempted, that thing simply refused to die. Many of my comrades did in the process, however. In the end, we could only bind him, and even that was only possible with the help of the saints. Sonny stared at the fearsome master, dumbfounded. Both his physical and spirit body destroyed, and yet he still exists. How is that even possible? He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. What is his aspect, exactly? Pierce and Wealth glanced at each other. In the end, the woman spoke. It has to do with mirrors, reflections, and souls. Prince Mordred is able to travel through mirrors and control the reflections. His second ability, though, is much more terrifying. If one looks at him through any form of a mirror, their soul will be devoured, and their body will become his. By taking a vessel, the prince inherits their memories, echoes, and even their aspect. But also their flaw, similar to the being you have encountered on the Reckoning Island, which was one of his creations. She fell silent for a few moments, and absent-mindedly touched the amulet in the shape of an anvil hanging around her neck. Pierce and I are immune to his powers. The rest of our soldiers, though, are not so fortunate. He had been taking one after another, using their bodies to kill the rest. The latest vessel of his was especially dangerous, since it possessed an aspect that allowed him to create puppets out of the dead bodies of our brothers and sisters. We managed to destroy the vessel, but the prince himself got away, just like before. We weren't able to use the binding and imprison him again. Sonny tilted his head a little. Now, finally, a lot of things had become clear. Why Mordred had been imprisoned, why the Night Temple was closed off to strangers, and why only the Echoes and the Lost were allowed to guard the prisoner. The former did not possess souls and couldn't be taken, while the latter could not return to the waking world even if the prince somehow escaped and took them as a vessel. Back in the waking world, catching him would be all but impossible, so. Suddenly, Sonny shivered. Noticing his expression, Pierce grinned darkly. I see you finally understand. Yes, don't think that you can reason with that beast or make use of the fact that his hatred is aimed at Clan Valor, and not you. Currently, there are only 4 people in this citadel whose bodies can allow him to eventually return to the waking world. Wealth and I cannot be taken, and neither can Lady Kasha, due to her blindness. Which leaves. Master Pierce stared at him with his cold, dangerous eyes. Sonny cursed. Only you. Chapter 578 Perfect Vessel. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Well, that's just damn great. The corner of Sonny's mouth twitched. The worst part was that he couldn't even disagree with Pierce's reasoning, because his own conclusion was more or less the same. Of course, Mordred was perfectly capable of making one of the Lost his vessel in hopes of traveling to the sanctuary, or a more remote human citadel, if need be, and stealing another body there. But why would he settle for a vastly inferior option when a perfect candidate was right there, his for the taking? Maybe that was the reason why he had not tried to seek out Sonny in the previous weeks. Mordred might have wanted to leave him for last. Thanks to Cassie, Sonny had a general idea about the aspects of both Wealth and Pierce. The fearsome master seemed to possess powers that made him highly resistant, if not outright immune, to various forms of attacks, while his more friendly counterpart specialized in enhancing her combat prowess and debilitating the enemy. Noting that only Wealth was wearing the strange anvil amulet, he made a guess that she was protected from Mordred's ability by its enchantment, while Pierce was capable of countering the possession simply through the might of his aspect. Cassie could not be taken, too, due to her blindness. One had to look at the reflection to be possessed, which she was incapable of. That left only Sonny. But more than that, Mordred had secretly watched him for months, and knew perfectly well how powerful Sonny actually was, as well as how he spoke, behaved, and carried himself. Who were his friends and who were his enemies? Mordred knew everything he needed to know to impersonate him perfectly, as well as how much would be gained by stealing his aspect, shadows, and memories. Truly, Sonny was an ideal vessel. It was almost as though this role had been predetermined for him from the very start. Damnation. He hesitated for a bit, then glanced at Pierce and Wealth, this time not even having to fake worry. So, what is the plan, then? The masters lingered for a bit. Then, Wealth spoke, her voice dark and bitter. We won't try to venture outside and try to bind that monster again. At this point, we don't have enough numbers to trap him anymore. However, he also has no way of infiltrating the inner sanctum, and the vessel that made time his best ally is destroyed. So, we will just wait. In about a week, maybe even less, Saint Cormac will return. Then, Prince Mordred will have to face a Transcendent's wrath. She clearly was not happy about having to take a passive approach, since, in a sense, this was as good as admitting defeat. But this plan of action did, indeed, seem like the best way to go, at least on the surface. All they had to do was barricade themselves inside the impregnable inner sanctum and wait for the cavalry to arrive. Surely, this much was within their ability. Sonny forced out a smile. That is, a good plan. Master Weld nodded, then turned to Cassie. Lady Kasia, if your aspect brings you a helpful vision, don't hesitate to inform me immediately. Now, please go and rest, you too. Eat your fill, we all need to keep up our strength. Just like that, the conversation was over. Sonny and Cassie stood up, bowed to the masters, then returned to the main hall. There, they endured the unfriendly gazes of the lost, filled 2 bowls with tasty-looking porridge, took a couple of opaque jars of water, and found a pair of empty straw mattresses in a remote corner. Sitting down, the 2 concentrated on the food, happy to finally eat something that was not synth paste. The meat porridge wasn't much, but to them, it tasted heavenly. After a while, Cassie said quietly while pretending to chew. What do you think? Sonny swallowed a spoonful of porridge, took a sip of water, and answered as he continued to stare at the floor. They are lying, of course. There is no way that Mordred won't get into the inner sanctum, somehow. He is too damn devious for that. I know it, and they know it, too. His shadow, meanwhile, watched the figure of the sentinel who could turn invisible, to make sure that she wasn't listening in on their conversation. He kept a neutral expression as he ate some more, then added without looking at the blind girl. What is most likely to happen is that things are going to go south very soon. Weld and Pierce will wait and observe for a bit, and then probably try to use us as bait to lay a trap for him. Cassie remained silent for a few moments, then asked. How do you know? He smiled. Because that's what I would have done. After that, both continued to eat, preoccupied with their own thoughts. A few moments passed before Cassie spoke again, her voice a bit uncertain. So then what do we do? Sonny enjoyed the taste of the porridge, chewed it slowly, and then answered calmly. For now. Nothing. Let's wait and observe, too. Rest and eat, just like we were told to. Restore our strength. Then, we'll see. They didn't speak after that, and, after finishing their food, allowed the exhaustion to overwhelm them. Laying side by side on the thin straw mattresses, Cassie and Sonny fell asleep. Only his watchful shadows remain alert, guarding their master through the night. When the 2 of them woke up, the air smelled of blood. Only 20.1 of the 20.3 lost were still alive. The 2 sentinels who kept watch outside the hall had been brutally slaughtered, without anyone even noticing how and when. Their bodies were still warm, and their blood painted the floors, the walls, and even the ceiling crimson, turning the somber corridor into a ghastly painting. In the center of the pool of blood, a single shard of mirror lay, as if mocking the surviving soldiers of the great clan Valor. Weld growled and destroyed it before anyone could approach. It seemed that Mordred chose not to hide the fact that he had entered the inner sanctum. Instead, he wanted everyone to know. To see what he had done. And wait, wondering. Whom would he take next? Chapter 579 First Victim. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The lost crowded near the entrance, staring at the grisly scene with grim expressions. Weld was in the corridor. She was standing in the middle of the pool of blood, her fists clenched. Sonny wasn't clear on who had discovered the bodies, since he only woke up due to the noise of everyone rushing to the door and the shine of the sparks of light as they summoned their weapons. He remained at the back of the crowd, using one of the shadows to study the corpses, and another to observe the surviving sentinels. There was a thoughtful expression on his face. I wonder. Before he could finish the thought, Pierce appeared from behind the bend of the corridor, glanced at Welv, shook his head briefly, and then growled at the Lost. What are you standing around for? Clean up this mess and secure the perimeter. No one moves alone or in pairs, 3 people minimum. Be ready, the bastard might return at any minute. The soldiers glanced at each other, seeds of fear blooming in the depths of their eyes. Then, they silently got to work, following the master's command. Sonny lingered for a few moments, then returned to Cassie and sat down on his mattress. The blind girl asked quietly. Who died? And how? He rubbed his face tiredly. The guards. One was the guy who had noticed my shadow back in the Great Hall. The other, I didn't know him. As to how, pretty much the same as everyone else. Butchered and cut to pieces. She thought for a bit, then frowned. And no one heard a thing. Sonny sighed. He must have done it really fast. Or his new vessel possesses an aspect that can dampen sounds. He remained silent for a bit, then said somberly. Anyway, you should prepare. Cassie tilted her head. Prepare for what? Another attack. Sonny didn't answer immediately, looking at the Lost. Everyone seemed busy and focused, moving with trained precision and purpose. However, there was a hint of uncertainty on their pale faces. The sentinels tried to hide it, but to no avail. He looked down. No. Right now, everyone only thinks that Mordred somehow broke through the seals and got into the inner sanctum. However, once they have time to think, they'll realize that there's another possibility. The blind girl paled. Sonny smiled darkly and added. That he has been with them this whole time, hiding in one of the 2 strangers who had miraculously escaped an enchanted cell and insisted on being taken to this shelter. You or me? Cassie gritted her teeth. There's no reasonable way to pin these murders on us. He chuckled. What does reason have to do with any of this? Reason is always the first victim when fear arrives. With that, he fell silent and, after a few seconds, rose to go and get them some breakfast. As Sonny walked toward the part of the hall that had been converted into a makeshift kitchen, many gazes followed him. Just as he had expected, they were slowly turning dark and dangerous, full of hostility, fear, and suspicion. Pretending to be appropriately frightened, too, he put some porridge in the bowls. Interesting. Mordred might not have been as crazed as Sonny had thought before. From the start of it, something about how the Prince of Nothing behaved had not sat right with him. Mordred had shown himself to be extremely cunning and meticulous, crafting such a masterful trap that even Sonny, who was an ingenious deceiver as well, fell into it without suspecting a thing. The sadistic way in which dozens of the Lost had been killed and the morbid displays of demented butchery that the prince had left in the halls of the Night Temple, however, were utterly impractical and did not fit into this image of a cold and calculating strategist at all. Now that Mordred had decided to reveal his presence in the inner sanctum and sacrifice the invaluable advantage of surprise in exchange for only 2 lives, Sonny became convinced that there was a method to this madness. And as the surviving Lost followed him with heavy gazes, dark expressions contorting their faces, he was pretty sure that he understood its purpose. Mordred wanted them to be suspicious of each other, he wanted them to be tense and scared. He wanted their spirits to break. Why? To make their souls weak and their willpower shaken, of course. Which suggested that his ability to devour souls was not absolute, and required the victim to be, what? To be defeated. To surrender. Or simply to be weaker than his. What a bastard. Sonny returned to Cassie and gave her a bowl of porridge, then frowned. Honestly, he wasn't sure who was scarier, an unhinged lunatic that enjoyed torturing his victims before murdering them in horrific ways, or a cold-blooded killer that uncaringly did the same simply because it suited his practical goals. Either way, the result would be the same. The Lost were shaken, but not nearly close to breaking down. Which meant that Mordred was not going to stop. No, he was only getting started sowing terror into the souls. The question was, how was Sonny supposed to stop him? He ate his porridge, then glanced at Pierce and Weld, who were speaking quietly near the doors. And should he? Soon, Master Pierce summoned the 10 echoes. Even though maintaining them at all times cost a considerable amount of essence, it was decided that the disturbing things would remain among the lost from now on. Several were sent to explore the inner sanctum and try to find signs of the attacker, or at least learn how he had managed to get inside. The rest assumed guarding positions outside the hall, making the remaining sentinels feel both relieved and tense. Not even these experienced warriors felt comfortable in the presence of human echoes. The security measures were enhanced, as well. No one was allowed to remain alone, and if there was a need to leave the common area, only groups of 3 could do so. Sonny and Cassie had to recruit the help of the female sentinel, the one who had the ability to turn invisible, just to visit the bathroom. And yet, none of these measures helped protect the stronghold. Come the next morning, 2 more lost were dead. This time, they were killed inside the hall itself, not even in the corridor outside. After that, things turned really ugly for Sonny. Chapter 580 Presumption of Guilt. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. 2 days had passed after the battle with Mordred's previous vessel and the army of corpse puppets he had created with its help. Those of the wounded who had received light injuries were already back on their feet, but 3 of the sentinels were still in bad shape. Their comrades were doing everything in their power to treat their wounds, but with every healer in the citadel already dead, there was little that could be done to hasten the recovery. One of the corners of the hall was converted into an infirmary, where the 3 heavily injured sentinels rested and received care. In the morning, a piercing scream suddenly echoed between the black stone walls. Those who were sleeping jumped up, grabbing the weapons that they had kept summoned to be ready for an attack. Those who remained awake were already moving, rushing toward the source of the scream, the makeshift infirmary. Sonny simply sat up on his mattress, a tense expression on his face. There were 3 cots for the wounded, standing in a row along the wall. It was the lost who occupied the middle one that was screaming, his face contorted by an expression of sheer terror. The other 2 were dead. Their throats were sliced open, blood streaming to the floor. Both were killed in their sleep, without alerting anyone around, as far away from the entrance to the hall as it was possible, right in the middle of the sentinels' camp. The third one clearly could have been murdered as well, and had been left alive on purpose, as if to mock the lost. It was as though Mordred was telling them that no one was safe, and that he was perfectly capable of taking each of them whenever he pleased. What? How did he get inside? He might still be here. The lost were on the verge of panicking, but in the end, their training and skill prevailed. Instead of descending into chaos, the situation inside the hall immediately turned into a coordinated action. Even before Pierce and Weld arrived, the sentinels were already moving to stand in a defensive formation, weapons drawn and ready for battle. The 2 masters appeared mere seconds after the scream. They quickly assessed the situation and joined their soldiers, half of the echoes moving closer, half barring the doors. For a few moments, there was a tense silence in the stronghold of the Valor forces. The surviving sentinels waited tensely by the infirmary, while 5 empty-eyed echoes blocked the exit. There was no one else in the hall, except for Sonny and Cassie, who had not moved from the start of it all. Slowly, all of the lost focused on the 2 of them. Their gazes were dark, cold, and full of danger. Sonny's face twitched. Crap. Was Mordred aware of how these actions would affect the 2 of them? Was he trying to force them out into the open on purpose, making it impossible to stay with the sentinels? What was his damn plan, really? What was his endgame? How was he planning to deal with St. Cormac in a few days, and what role was everyone else supposed to play before that? He opened his mouth, wishing to say something to defuse the situation, but one of the lost was faster. It's them. It must be one of them. As soon as this first accusation was made, the floodgates were open. A moment later, Sunny and Cassie were assaulted by a litany of cries, all blaming them for the deaths of the two wounded sentinels. Sunny stared at the crowd of Lost, feeling his heart grow cold. A single person could be reasoned with, but what he saw right now was not a group of people, but a massive creature with many heads, many shouting mouths, and many eyes that burned with fury, fear, and dark, murderous intent. A frightened crowd did not know reason, it only knew fear, and the desire to either escape or destroy its source. Ironically, there were very few things more frightening than a senseless crowd. The Lost were much more resilient and prepared than most people, but even battle-hardened warriors like them had a limit. After weeks of being hunted, slaughtered, and brutalized by the elusive and terrifying fiend, they seemed to have finally reached it. Of course, there was no logic behind the accusations. Neither Sunny nor Cassie possessed the means to commit the murder unnoticed, simply for the fact that they had been watched this entire time, since no one really trusted them, to begin with. But his attempt to explain this was drowned by the chorus of angry shouts. Sunny noticed Pierce and Wealth exchanging a quick look, their faces calm, but somber. At least these two had managed to keep a cool head, but would that change anything? His heartbeat slowed. Sunny mentally took in the entirety of the hall, the echoes standing guard near the doors, the two masters, the formation of the Lost, the dead sentinels laying on the blood-soaked cots. Would he be able to fight his way out of this place? And what would happen next? The forces of valor would surely pursue him and Cassie. It was at this moment that a sudden realization hit him. Sunny hesitated for a moment, then slowly rose to his feet. His hand hovered in the air, as if ready to summon a weapon. That action was enough to cause a chain effect among the Lost. One of them suddenly lunged forward, throwing a javelin at Sunny. Another drew his bow, an arrow already knocked on the string. Nothing came of it, however. Almost instantly, Pierce growled, his voice easily suppressing the shouts. "Stop, you wretched bastards! Who ordered you to attack? Anyone who moves, I'll kill myself." At the same time, Wealth turned into a blur and appeared in front of Sunny, catching the javelin before it could get anywhere near him. She looked at the weapon with a scowl, then threw it on the floor. The echoes standing in front of the sentinel formation suddenly turned, facing the Lost. Their empty eyes stared at the frightened warriors, no emotion in them. Just like that, the two masters tamed the wild beast of the human crowd. No matter how far gone the sentinels were, there were still remnants of discipline etched deep into their bones. More than that, the easiest way to defeat fear was with a different, much greater fear. Under the unnerving gaze of the echoes, the accusing shouts abruptly stopped. The Lost hesitated, then hesitantly lowered their weapons. However, their burning gazes were still focused on Sunny and Cassie, their thirst for violence temporarily leashed, but not quenched. Wealth lingered for a moment, then looked at them over her shoulder. "You better come with me. It is not safe for the two of you to remain with the others. Don't worry, though. We'll keep you safe." Sunny pretended to shiver, glanced at the crowd of the Lost, and nodded. "Sure. Yeah, no problem." Inwardly, though, he was grinning. "Keep us safe. What a bunch of crap." Sunny and Cassie were led deeper into the inner sanctum. They passed the room with the round table where the two masters had first interrogated them, then the personal quarters of the ascended knights, and were finally led to a small room with a single door. Wealth let them inside and remained at the threshold. She was quiet for a few moments, and then said, "Wait for a bit. I will bring you food and water later. This will be your lodgings from now on, so get comfortable." With that, she closed the door and left. Sunny smiled darkly. He didn't hear the click of the lock, but the implication was clear. The small room was much more comfortable than the iron cage, but it served the same purpose. Once again, they were in a prison cell, however, Sunny knew that this time, they won't be staying in it long.